I can see that our numbers are still moving up slightly. I can see that our numbers are still moving up slightly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think people are still filtering in. My name is Kobe Rizik. I'm the president of the Buckley Program. Also online this afternoon, we have our publicity director, Rosie Braceras, who is moderating this event alongside me. Welcome to this Zoom lecture titled The 1619 Project, a Missed Opportunity with Professor Lucas Morrill of Washington and Lee University. Before we introduce Professor Morrill formally, I want to say a few words about the Buckley Program. First, for those of you who don't know, the William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, as well as an annual conference. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere, especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge. Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. All Yale undergraduate and graduate students are eligible to become fellows, and if you're currently a fellow, please share this opportunity with your friends and peers. The deadline to apply this semester will be October 15th.
Now on to Professor Morrill. Lucas Morrill is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and the head of politics of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University. Professor Morrill also teaches in the master's program in American History and Government at Ashland University in Ohio. Summer programs for the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy, and high school teacher workshops sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute, the John M. Ashbrook Center, and the Jack Miller Center and the Liberty Fund. Professor Morrill is the author of Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, and editor of Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages. He is also the editor of Ralph Ellison and The Raft of Hope, a political companion to the Invisible Man, and co-editor of The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. His most recent book is Lincoln and the American Founding. He is a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War, was a member of the Scholarly Board of Advisors for the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and a member of the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States. We will allot the first 25 minutes or so this afternoon for Professor Morell to give his remarks, and then move right into questions from the moderators and the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please submit it in writing using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will end this event promptly at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. With that, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Lucas Morell to the Buckley Program. Professor Morell, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Rosie and Kobe and the Buckley Program at Yale University for this invitation to speak. Dare I quote Rush Limbaugh, I am equal time. Let me also thank my former student, Madeline Gee. She was Madeline Lucas at the time at WNL, for bringing this program to my attention. I'm sure everybody's heard about the 1619 Project by now, and I hope you've read the lead essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's been about a year since the project was launched in August of 2019, and it's now in high schools. She won a Pulitzer Prize for journalism commentary, not for history, and she's now collaborating with Oprah Winfrey on film projects and with Random House on several book projects. We can safely say that the 1619 Project is a cultural phenomenon. And for that reason, it deserves our scrutiny because of its claims about the true founding of America and the legacy of slavery. A year ago, about this time, I called her effort a missed opportunity. I found her essay not only deficient in its understanding of both the American founding and my specialty, Abraham Lincoln, but I found it also very politically divisive in its presentation of American history as simply heroic Black virtue triumphing over persistent white vice. Today, I hope to show how she missed the mark, how a project that aimed to give Americans a better perspective on their past failed to do so in an accurate and fair-minded way. She's actually made our history more difficult to understand and likely contributed to a greater polarization of our civic life. She gave her 7,300-word essay a two-sentence title. Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true. She claims the Declaration of Independence does not mark the beginning of a new era in human civilization, but yet another notch on the belt of white supremacy's oppressive march on American soil, whose actual birth date, according to her, was the year 1619, when 20 slaves, some people argue it was indentured servants, but 20 slaves landed near Jamestown. Now, not all men are created equal, according to her, but racial slavery is the foundation of America. What Hannah-Jones never explains, though, is how the Declaration ever happened. If color prejudice ran so deeply in white America's veins, how was the spirit of 76 even possible? She takes this and many other examples of white contributions to the freedom struggle for granted. To her credit, she ably informs us of many important contributions that Blacks have made to America's political and cultural prosperity. Unfortunately, she presents her cri de coeur under the guise of history for those she believes have drunk the Kool-Aid of American mythology about freedom and equality for all. While her debt to Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and especially Ralph Ellison is evident in her account of how Black people were essential to American progress, she excludes significant facts that would ruin her disingenuous argument about the American founders and their greatest defender, Abraham Lincoln. Her lead essay for the 1619 Project is really an essay about visibility. It's about how we see America's founding, how we see Black Americans, their role in the country's development. It's ultimately about how we see each other, both as fellow citizens and as human beings. Ralph Ellison, the author of the great American novel Invisible Man, called this moral perception, the perception of the wholeness of American life and the cost of its successes and failures. By wholeness, Ellison meant that despite many decades of enslavement and segregation of Black people on American soil, Americans across the color line were far more connected than they realize. That the influences went in both directions even before discriminatory barriers were removed. It's a point Hannah Jones tried to make, but I think she fumbled when she looked at only one side of that connection, the Black American side, and misseeing or chose to ignore the other side, a majority of white America that did not simply act as one gigantic monster of white supremacy throughout its history. Her mistake, what makes her interpretation of American history so bad, was to interpret that history as a zero-sum story, where the recovered strivings of Black folk had to displace the recorded achievements of white folk, especially those we have long been taught to view as iconic representatives of the American way. What was needed was a more capacious revision of American history. We do need to highlight the heroic participation and patriotism of Black Americans, but we must also be honest about the challenge and the obstacles the founders faced in trying to establish a free society in a land long accustomed to slavery, and appreciate as well the national crisis that Lincoln faced when he tried to get white Americans to re-adopt the Declaration of Independence as the moral compass of their political practice. Instead, riddled with half-truths, overstatements, out-of-context quotations, and errors of fact and interpretation about the founding and Lincoln, Hannah Jones's history distorts our past, and it actually works at cross purposes with her own argument that it was Black Americans who made our ideals true. As you might guess, I think the good part or the good intention of her project is vastly outweighed by the bad and the ugly parts. Let's begin with what could have been a worthwhile contribution to our self-understanding. That's her effort to highlight how Black Americans have been an intrinsic part of the American story from the beginning. I think that the best part of her essay is what I believe she owes to Ralph Ellison, who said it better. Few commentators on the 1619 Project have focused on the main thread of her article, which was her initial puzzlement of her father, her Black father's puzzlement. Her puzzlement over her Black father's patriotism. He was a Black American who fought in the US Army. He experienced racial harassment and discrimination, but he insisted on flying proudly an American flag on the front lawn. She didn't understand this, but then she eventually recognized that her father's steadfast devotion to the United States, despite the racial bigotry he experienced, owed to his recognition of how much his country was the product of Black American blood, sweat, toil, and tears. His appreciation of the many ways his Black American ancestors helped shape the language, literature, politics, and economics of his homeland. And so Hannah Jones comes to appreciate her father's patriotism because it flows from his awareness that America's redeeming qualities were in part the product of a people forged in the crucible of American slavery and segregation. Dr. Carter Woodson, the creator of what he called Negro History Week, what is now known as African American History Month, he defined the meaning of Negro History Week as follows. He says, it's not so much a Negro History Week as it is a history week. We should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. Those are his quotations. I think this reflects a laudable concern that Black contributions to American prosperity be noted and not ignored. W.B. Du Bois commented on the role of Black people in America in his book of essays, The Souls of Black Folk. Your country How came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Actively, we have woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. Our song, our toil, our cheer, and warning have been given to this nation in blood brotherhood. Are not these gifts worth giving? In the words of Ralph Ellison, a people must define itself, and minorities have the responsibility of having their ideals and images recognized as part of the composite image, which is that of the still forming American people. So Black American history, or rather Blacks in American history, is also important as it shows how Black Americans forced white Americans to take their ideals seriously. In his 1970 Time magazine article, Ralph Ellison observed that today it is the Black American who puts pressure upon the nation to live up to its ideals. It is he who gives creative tension to our struggle for justice. Now, this was in 1970. Now, a major way that Blacks have shaped American history is their political activism on behalf of the ideals of the regime. And Ellison thought that American could not survive being deprived this presence, because by the irony implicit in the dynamics of American democracy, they symbolize both its most stringent testing and the possibility of its greatest human freedom. So aware of the failures in the early American Republic to secure the rights of all Americans right away, Ellison still called the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights sacred documents, which gives more credit to the founders than Hannah Jones does in her essay. So how does she misread the founders and therefore the ideals and institutions that for the first time in human history committed a people to the principles of equality, the rights of the individual, and government by consent of the governed? It's not hard to point out how bad her history is. Her thesis and related essays under the auspices of the 1619 Project have received serious criticism that can readily be found online and in print. Historians, political scientists, economists, let's try that, from across the political spectrum have weighed the 1619 Project and found it seriously wanting in terms of its scholarship. For example, she lambasts Jefferson's fellow white colonists for establishing a network of laws and customs to perpetuate slavery, despite knowing that Black people were fellow human beings. But she omits many facts that speak to the contrary. For example, between 1781 and 83, right at the end, if you will, of the American Revolutionary War, Massachusetts abolished slavery when slaves themselves sued for their freedom. How? On the basis of the Massachusetts Constitution's Declaration of Rights, which declared all men are born free and equal. Do the courts of Massachusetts, relying on the Massachusetts Constitution, count as part of that network of laws and customs? She ignores it or is not aware of it. Massachusetts was one of several American colonies, including Virginia, that attempted to prevent the importation of slaves, only to see those efforts rebuffed by the royal governor and King George III. What do these efforts by American states indicate about colonial intentions, right? Even before they were states, if you will, for the future of slavery on American soil? Surely King George III's veto of American attempts to ban slave importation made it more difficult. The king made it more difficult for Americans to wean themselves off of the peculiar institution. And this was a fact that Jefferson, in fact, actually included in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence before it was redacted by the Second Continental Congress. Had Hannah Jones read the writings of slaveholders like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, she would have learned that they not only acknowledged the injustice of slavery, but they discussed the obstacles to emancipation, at least in the near term. This is completely missing in her account. The American founders were revolutionaries, to be sure, but prudence marked their efforts to establish national independence in light of the pre-existing institution of slavery in the 13 diverse states. They certainly didn't invent it. During the Revolutionary War and the early efforts to cement union of the American states, the founders believed that they could not free themselves and free their slaves at the same time. To insist on the latter as a condition of the former would have doomed both projects. For example, South Carolina and Georgia were land rich, but labor poor, and they themselves were hesitant to do anything too quickly to stem the flow of slaves into their states. To lose their support during the Revolutionary War or thereafter, when only a united effort to throw off British rule promised any hope of success, would have made an already audacious enterprise much less likely to succeed. Her essay reflects a woeful ignorance of the writings of the founders, who always affirmed that all human beings possessed natural rights, all of them. The slaveholding founders were all too aware that the enslaved had legitimate grievances. As Jefferson put it, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained will divide us into parties, produce convulsions, which will probably never end, but in the extermination of one or the other race. Jefferson admitted that deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, that's his quote, he admitted that this would further complicate any attempt to free blacks in a way that would enable them to enjoy their natural rights. He thought that emancipation would need to be followed by expatriation, or what we call black colonization, in order to induce a white population fearful of retribution, just retribution, by former slaves to secure justice for the enslaved. This was, of course, speculation on his part, but not unfounded, as the Gabriel Prosser revolt in Virginia and the Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture, illustrated the potential for a race war wherever slaves outnumbered the white population. Even Alexis de Tocqueville, the most famous and astute foreign observer of America in the 1830s and 40s, he predicted that there would be a race war in the South. According to the 1619 Project's lead essay, there's no debate, there's no struggle among the exclusively white framers of the Constitution in their efforts to form a more perfect union. To leave out this significant element of the founding era is to miss an important aspect of America's political development, namely that we were a nation born of struggle, of debate, of argument, and most often of peaceful resolution. It's not only a more capacious account of our founding in history, but also a more engaging one to teach our youth, K through 12. Their civic education will be more accurate, more lively, and more constructive as they learn about the ideals and leading actors of our nation's history, along with their struggle to do the right thing in the midst of a wrong thing, if you will. So we've covered the good and some of the bad of the 1619 Project. Now for the ugly. It is Nicole Hannah-Jones's account of Abraham Lincoln. To complete her takedown of the founders, she must take down their greatest defender, Lincoln. She claims that Lincoln, quote, believed that free black people were a troublesome presence, and she has that in quotes, incompatible with a democracy intended only for white people, close quote. What she doesn't know or was not aware of when she quoted that was that Lincoln was not giving his opinion, but in fact, the opinion of Kentucky Senator and slave owner Henry Clay. Henry Clay's opinion about the difficulty of having free blacks coexisting with enslaved blacks in the same community. In an 1852 eulogy, speaking of Clay's leadership of the American Colonization Society, Lincoln said of Clay, and this is the quote, this is Lincoln, he, describing Clay, considered it no demerit in the society that it tended to relieve slaveholders from the troublesome presence of free Negroes, end quote. So Lincoln was describing Clay's opinion, not his own. By the 1850s, the agitation over slavery was threatening to divide the Union, and the prospects for peaceful, lawful abolition looked increasingly distant. Clay's efforts to encourage free blacks to establish a self-governing colony in Africa, for example, met with Lincoln's approval because he thought it could lessen the growing divide in America and perhaps facilitate the eventual emancipation of all enslaved blacks on American soil. Hannah-Jones compounds her error by omitting the context of Lincoln's direct and bracing speech to local Black leaders in DC in August of 1862. When he told them to consider the prospects of colonization, stating, quote, "Your race suffer very greatly, many of them, by living among us, while ours suffer from your presence," end quote. He was pointing out the pervasive white prejudice that made coexistence a terrible difficulty. With the nation at war with itself, with a white majority and a longstanding prejudice against Black people, Lincoln was trying to prepare Americans for a proclamation of emancipation in rebel-held states. The president needed to show the country, and he had a reporter present, that all avenues for resolving the conflict were being pursued before he resorted to emancipation by way of an executive military proclamation. Hannah-Jones acknowledges that Lincoln had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation when he invited these local Black leaders to the White House, but was concerned about its reception by white Americans. But then she asserts that Lincoln, quote, "also opposed Black equality," end quote. She quotes a comment he made during his 1858 debates with Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. Now, she's not a historian, but she could have gotten the history right if she learned a little more about and then presented the context that is essential to understanding what and why something was said, especially by someone as iconic as Lincoln. In their first formal debate, Stephen Douglas declared, "I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever." This is Stephen Douglas, the incumbent Democratic senator. That's the context for Lincoln's response. He was responding to Douglas's unabashed white supremacy in states where Blacks were not allowed to vote, they couldn't serve on juries, where whites were defendant, and they couldn't serve in the militia. Lincoln, instead of enshrining white prejudice, is trying to build a bridge from a bigoted citizenry to where he wanted them to go, admittedly one step at a time. Hannah-Jones did quote Lincoln correctly when he said that he did not favor making Black Illinoisans at that time politically and socially our equals, but she failed to appreciate that Lincoln had to respond in a manner that could appeal to moderate elements of a state where, as I said, Blacks couldn't vote. And in fact, in the 1850s, Blacks were banned from even entering the state. If Lincoln was playing the race card, as some people claim, I think Douglas was playing the whole deck. But I don't think he played it in the way that she portrays. In a state where white supremacy was the norm and not the exception, what to me is remarkable is the degree to which Lincoln defends the natural rights of Black people, where Douglas explicitly interprets the Declaration of Independence as having no application to Black people. Lincoln affirms the exact opposite. Here's his quote. "There is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I hold that he is as much entitled to these as the white man," end quote. So while Lincoln concedes some level of inequality between whites and Blacks, he does not exploit or reinforce white prejudice towards Blacks. So instead of the racial demagoguery that we have from the incumbent Democratic senator, Stephen Douglas, we see in Lincoln what I believe is an ennobling statesmanship as he tries to move his audience from their current feelings of bigotry towards a more enlightened view of their fellow human beings. So Lincoln can say the following: "I agree with Judge Douglas that he," and he's describing Black people, "is not my equal in many respects." Now watch what Lincoln says here. "Certainly not in color, perhaps not in moral or intellectual endowment, but in the right to eat the bread without leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns. He is my equal, the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man." So we contrast the unapologetic white supremacy of Douglas with Lincoln's efforts to inform and elevate public opinion on the question of what Black Americans are owed by their government, which is to say, what they're owed by fellow white citizens. Lincoln reminds his white audience of the basic ground of their own rights, the rights spelled out in the Declaration. And he has the courage in an election year where no Black Illinoisans get to vote to insist that the natural rights of white people are the same as that of Black people. When Hannah Jones asserts anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, and she cites Lincoln's presidency as yet another example of how this played out poorly for Blacks in American history, she gives no credit to the president who did the most to preserve, protect, and defend, even to the point of war, the Constitution, and the kind of country that could secure the rights of racial minorities. There's no mention, and boy, I could do a whole list, a longer list, but there's no mention of Lincoln's vigorous critique of the 1857 Dred Scott opinion, where he lambasts Chief Justice Roger Taney for reading Black people out of the Declaration and laments that all the powers of earth seem rapidly combining against Black people. No mention, of course, of the Gettysburg Address, which Lincoln delivered in the year of Jubilee, the year following emancipation, or the year of the Emancipation Proclamation, where he challenged the nation to experience a new birth of freedom, one that would now include 3 to 4 million Blacks as fellow citizens deserving the protection of government of the people, by the people, for the people. No mention of Lincoln's second inaugural address, an oration still unsurpassed in its acknowledgement that slavery was a profound wrong committed by America towards her Black inhabitants, and which the Almighty may have rectified by allowing a devastating civil war and yielding an emancipation neither side seriously expected. No mention of Lincoln's repeated advocacy of giving Blacks the vote in 1864 and 1865, when only 6 states in the entire American Union allowed Black people to vote. And of course, there's no mention that Lincoln was assassinated precisely because of these efforts, for which Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist orator and escaped slave, called him the first martyr president of the United States. But for Lincoln, whose words and deeds remain the gold standard for American rhetoric and policy, the United States would have strayed from the path set by the founders. What Hannah Jones describes as racist ideology that Jefferson and the framers had used at the nation's founding, Lincoln described this as the definitions and axioms of a free society. Lincoln understood the predicament of the founders. In his final debate with Stephen Douglas, he observed, "We had slaves among us, and we could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to as much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties." So Lincoln countered by teaching, Stephen Douglas countered by teaching white Northerners not to care if the enslavement of Black people spread into federal territories. And he did this all in the name of the fathers. He claimed this was the founders' intention, that they were indifferent about the spread of slavery. Lincoln rejected this categorization of the founders as neutral regarding the future of slavery in America. And so interestingly enough, in the 1850s, Lincoln considered Douglas, not Southern defenders of slavery, the most dangerous enemy of liberty, as he put it, because the most insidious one. Douglas was teaching Americans to see voting as an expression of mere self-interest, a mere matter of majority might dictating right. Lincoln saw that for slavery to become national, Northerners needed not to be persuaded by Southerners that slavery was a positive good, like John Calhoun preached. All you have to do is persuade white Northerners not to care what happens to people who don't look like them, and therefore Congress should not prevent the spread of Black slavery into the federal territories. Once that happened, it was only a matter of time before slavery would become legal everywhere in the United States. That Hannah Jones ignores Lincoln's efforts on behalf of Black Americans muddles her attempt to view American history through the lens of Black patriotism. Throughout American history, Black Americans have needed the ideals and institutions as well as the people, which includes the vast white majority of the United States, to ensure progress in protecting their civil and political rights. And let me close with this. Despite her claim that, quote, for the most part, Black Americans fought back alone, end quote, they simply could not do this without the help of a whole lot of white Americans. Let American history provide the lesson. If the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments required a Black majority in Congress in order to pass, if the unanimous Supreme Court that ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional, if that court required Black justices, how secure would the rights of Black Americans today be? Surely the progress Americans have made on this front had everything to do with the principle of equality taking hold over more and more Americans, most of whom were white. And of course, the Congress I mentioned, the court I mentioned, there weren't Blacks in any of them. And yet the right thing was done by them. Like Ralph Ellison, Hannah Jones writes that to this day, Black Americans more than any other group embrace the democratic ideals of a common good. Now I say this will continue to hold true only if Black Americans continue to learn that the American founding was essentially good, not anti-Black racism down to our DNA. If Americans of all races learn that the spirit of 76 reflects the better angel of our political nature and not some demon to be exorcised, then they can reclaim their common political heritage. Otherwise, our political polarization will worsen, and what Ellison called the mystique of race will continue to hinder our twofold attempt to understand our composite national identity and engender the trust that is necessary for racial diversity to strengthen rather than weaken our national union. Thank you.
Rosie, you're muted.
There she is.
At this point, I would like to remind people to add their questions to the Q&A section on Zoom. And I'm going to start off with one of my own questions, which is, why are American public schools adopting the 1619 Project curriculum if so many historians have spoken out against it?
That is a great question. I work a lot with high school teachers. I not only teach in the master's program, as you guys mentioned in the intro, up at Ashland University for teachers who want a master's, not in education, but in history and government. So I work with a lot of teachers and who are hungry to know what the latest in historical scholarship and politics scholarship is. But I also do a lot of workshops across the country with different organizations like Gilder Lehrman, the Ashbrook Center, and Jack Miller Center, and others. And so I get to know a lot of teachers this way. My wife is a K-8 principal, so I'm a product of the public schools. I grew up in Southern California, as you can tell by my accent. So I know this. And what teachers need and they don't have is time. And so if anybody can present to them lesson plans that are already kind of, all set to go in a box where they don't have to do any a tremendous amount of reading and preparation, that is a godsend to them. And so when the leading paper of record in this country, which is the New York Times, produces a magazine entirely devoted to this thesis that America is racist to its core, the teachers presume that this is the latest in scholarship, that it has been vetted by historians, that it has passed some level of peer review that rises to the level of trustworthiness. And Nicole Hannah Jones says that it was vetted by some historians, but almost no articles are written by historians or political scientists or economists. And the lead article was written by her, and she's a journalist. She's not a historian. She's not a political scientist. She's not an economist. And so getting back to your question, the teachers assume that a reputable authority like the New York Times doing this, and of course, providing it for free, surely they wouldn't do something like this unless it passed muster among the consensus of historians. And can you find historians that will support the project? Sure you can. But the degree to which the scholarship has been shown to be so deficient from scholars across the political spectrum, and most famously on a Marxist website, has hosted these interviews with James McPherson, Gordon Wood, Sean Wilentz, Alan Gelzo. I mean, that shows you that there isn't a kind of hidden conservative hand in this. That the tried and true historians of this period, especially the Civil War, historians of the Civil War and the American Revolution, they have shot this thing to pieces. One of the historians who was actually vetting the project published an essay in The Atlantic explaining that she pointed out to Nicole Hannah-Jones that a very important fact that you claim is not a fact, and in fact is false, and that was just dismissed. And so I don't know beyond that why they would continue to use material that has been shown time and again to be deficient, except for the fact that again, a paper of record and an authority considered it important enough to use. And there's probably also a racial angle in this. I think that in many of these communities, they are trying to find a way to show Black youth in particular that their ancestors weren't simply enslaved, but were actually part of what I call the long civil rights movement, American history, that they were struggling against tyranny, against oppression, which I agree that all happened. And so I think part of this project is a way to bolster self-esteem among youth of color in the United States. And if the facts aren't entirely correct, they're not going to be too bothered with that. But that's a great question.
Thank you again, Professor. Kind of going along with that question, one question I had written down here is kind of thinking in terms of historiography and the historical method, and you're a historian. The method of Hannah-Jones's project, which some may consider not strictly historical, is a method that seems to privilege narrative over hard history and kind of privilege cherry-picked evidence over more accurate depictions of the past. And I'm curious if those who are opponents of the project can adequately fight it and combat it using kind of traditional historical means. Mm-hmm. Can the kind of extreme revisionist historical moment that we're in right now be combated with traditionalist historical method? Or is there some way that maybe we on the other side of the argument who oppose the project need to change our method to make it more sort of marketable to the general public? Because it seems to me that just kind of saying, oh, this isn't accurate, we don't agree with this, as thousands and thousands of schools start to adopt it, as Rosie mentioned, and more people begin to read it, doesn't do much to actually combat it and maybe provide an alternative.
Yeah, we have to be careful here. I first should clarify, I do history, but I'm a trained political scientist. The reason why I have to do history as part of my political science is because I study Lincoln, and you can't study Lincoln without knowing a lot of history, especially about the Civil War and antebellum America. So as a political scientist, I think I am qualified to discuss the history and how bad the history is of this project. We use this word a lot today, which drives me nuts, narrative. And it's a fancy word for saying story. Now, even Nicole Hannah-Jones on multiple occasions has said, it's not a history, it's not a history, it's not a history, okay? I'm a journalist. All I'm trying to do is reframe how we look at history. And it's been framed a particular way by other people. Now I'm in a position, right? Not everybody gets to write for the New York Times. Now I'm in a position to speak from a position of power, from a position of authority. And in so doing, I am going to use history, but for a particular aim. And her aim, and she has said this on multiple occasions, is reparations. She wants a reparations bill to be passed in the United States. She said on multiple occasions, you cannot read all of the essays of the 1619 Project and not get the feeling that something is owed. So she has made this emphatic, something is owed, something is owed. She wants reparations. Now, not personally isn't the big deal. She thinks Black people, descendants of the slaves, are owed reparations. So she has been frank about her objective, her aim. She has been frank, and in fact, in a way, walking back the historical elements of it, because she's been hammered so much about it. Says repeatedly now, it's not history, it's a reframing. I'm telling a narrative, I'm telling a story. Now, if what you're saying is we can't fight an incorrect, an unhistorical story with the correct facts, we have to fight it with a counter narrative. What we are actually doing is conceding an important point about history, which is the truth. If there is such a thing as history, and she acknowledges there is a history, things actually happen. In other words, she's either right or wrong that 20 some odd slaves, 20 to 30 slaves or indentured servants landed at Point Comfort in 1619. I mean, that's a matter of the record. Some things are clear, some things are more murky. What happened to them over time? There weren't laws about slavery at that time. So were they treated as indentured servants or were they treated as slaves? So that's a matter of historiography. But it seems like when she's walking away from history and saying, well, it's just a narrative, it's just, we're looking at it through a different lens, we're reframing it. What she's actually saying is, what determines the story is not the truth, but power. What determines the story is not the truth, but power. And it seems like the conclusion that she's leading us to is as follows. It doesn't ultimately matter what happened. What matters is who has the power to tell the story? Who has the authority to make their agenda the right agenda? And in that sense, and I'm too Lincolnian to accept that, that's a world where might is dictating right and not the other way around. And so I would not say to the opponents, well, you just have to come up with a better narrative, leverage your authority and power, etc. No, I think we have to remind Americans that we have to get our history right. To be right, we have to get our history right. And I am not afraid about teaching slaves. She talks about her project as if she's the first person to tell American youth that slavery happened in this country, and it happened as far back as 1619. Lincoln knew it, Douglas knew it, the founders knew it. This is not news, okay? The Black contribution to American history. I cited Du Bois, I cited Ralph Ellison, I cited Carter Woodson. All of these men, important figures in their own right, made the point that Blacks are part of the warp and woof of the United States. If the history books aren't telling that story, change the history books and get the facts right. Don't change the narrative. If you're just changing the narrative, what you're saying is, well, I have a certain objective, and if I can offer a plausible story to support that objective, then we're all good. I am not content with a plausible story. I want to get the facts right. I want to get the history right. Why do I study Ralph Ellison? I'm a political scientist. Why am I reading English literature? I'm reading American literature by one of the great novelists, Ralph Ellison, because he teaches me something about America that I didn't get by reading Washington or Jefferson, Madison, or even Lincoln. So I'm interested in the truth about this country. I'm interested in the truth about its history. And that's what we need our youth to be interested in. If what they learn is, well, my people back in the day didn't have the power to tell my story, and therefore we heard somebody else's story. Now we do have the power, let's tell our story. I want that kid to say, but we got to get the story right. Let's be truthful about it. That's a story that we can be proud of, not something that we think simply serves a political objective. And it's clear that this project has a political objective, a political agenda.
Thank you for that. So an audience member, you sort of touched on this at the very end, was wondering, how much does Howard Zinn's hand in the current historical dialogue in this country sort of play a part in the continued use of the 1619 project? And how do we establish that the truth is important and vital in history rather than here's lens that we should be looking at history, sort of
Right.
the way that the 1619 Project does it.
Yeah, the teachers that I work with, they all know Howard Zinn's history. So Zinn's been around for decades. That's not news. And so in a way, Nicole Hannah-Jones is the product of that. She's been shaped by Howard Zinn, and more importantly, and more directly, a man named Lerone Bennett. Lerone Bennett was an editor at Ebony magazine in the 60s. In the 1960s, he wrote an essay, about a 6-page essay on Lincoln, basically arguing that Lincoln was a racist. And then he turned that into a book in 1999 of over 600 pages. I wrote a review of it and said that the only way he could have gotten Lincoln more wrong is by misspelling his name. So Lerone Bennett wrote a book called Before, I think it's called, Before the Mayflower Compact or something, or Before the Mayflower, something like that. And Nicole Hannah-Jones said that book made a great impression on her in high school. And what that book taught was this idea that what the great things about this country were not about white people because they were racist. The great things about this country were what Black people, the oppressed, did. And so I would say it's Zinn and Lerone Bennett are shaping this particular way of thinking about the United States. She wants to say that there's two foundings. It wasn't 1776, it was 1619 and 1776. If you go to her Twitter account, she has 1776, July 4th, lined out. She makes it clear that's not the most important date. The most important date is 1619. Okay. When Lincoln said the important date was 7 years ago, he thought the founding was July 4th. Okay. So Nicole Hannah-Jones is a part of this world that was shaped by Zinn, and especially for Black youth of my generation, by Lerone Bennett and his book, again, I'm blanking on the name, but it's something like Before the Mayflower. And so I think, yeah, the short answer to that question is yes, it's Zinn's counter narrative. It definitely does not preach that the slaveholding founders were men that we should be putting up statues and plaques and monuments to. So yeah, there's a real fight among, well, I wouldn't say it's a fight, but there is a tension among especially early American historians with regards to how much we should cheer Washington and Jefferson and Madison because of what they consider America's original sin, which was slavery. So is it only 2 cheers for Washington? At least he freed those he had authority over in his will, whereas Jefferson only freed maybe a handful. So only 1 cheer for Jefferson. That's a real struggle among early American historians right now. And it's certainly a struggle among historians of Lincoln and scholars of Lincoln who want to still hold on to Lincoln as the great emancipator, but are troubled by some of the more controversial things that he was in favor of, like Black colonization and some statements he made during his debates with Stephen Douglas. My current book, I'm on sabbatical right now. My current book on Lincoln is entitled Lincoln, Race, and the Fragile American Republic, where I'm going to take on all of this. I'm going to take on his most controversial policies, or those that look controversial today, and controversial statements that he made, and explain them within the context of a nation that was continuing to fracture and divide. And therefore, Lincoln had to, what he did, how he did anything about race and about slavery had everything to do with its connection to the viability of American self-government, which he thought was waning in the 1850s. America was becoming a country he was increasingly not recognizing. And so what gave him guidance, my book, Lincoln and the Founding, was the founders. He didn't think they were hypocrites. He thought that they were, as I call it, prudential revolutionaries, and were in a bind at the time of the founding. They did not believe they could attempt to free themselves and free their slaves at the same time, but were setting up the institutions that would enable them to do so.
Thank you so much, Professor. There's two audience questions that I hope I can ask you both now, and then you can kind of morph it into one answer if you want to.
Yes, no, and maybe.
So the first one is recently you had a disagreement with historian Sean Willents, who is, I believe, another opponent of the 1619 project, about Senator Tom Cotton's use of the term necessary evil.
Right.
To describe race-based slavery in an interview over the summer. So if you could talk a little bit about the substance of that argument. And then the second question, which Yale students, of which there are many on the call, will care about, is, and And in one essay, you've supported the retention of Robert E. Lee's name in the name of Washington and Lee University.
Right.
There was, of course, some pushback against your essay.
I got bold. Go ahead.
Someone even likened it to Yale's retention of Eli Yale as its namesake. So if you could also talk a little bit about that argument and sort of where you see that going.
All right. Yeah. Those two questions in one question. Fantastic. I'll do the first part. Sean Huelentz, I think I met one time, maybe 10, 15 years ago when I was on sabbatical up at Princeton. Fantastic historian. I got into this kerfuffle late. I did not hear Senator Cotton's initial statement. And when I went back to look at it, he did say it in an awkward and clumsy way. It made it sound like he thought, well, we couldn't have freedom in this country without slavery. So slavery was necessary. That was not what he meant. And it was certainly not his understanding of the founders. And Huelentz, I argue in his response to Senator Cotton, he was trying to make peace with the people at the New York Review of Books, among others. His book, No Property in Man, which is an excellent book, makes the argument that the Constitution wasn't a pro-slavery argument. It was both pro-liberty and pro-slavery in terms of its compromises. But because he deigned to go against consensus historians who wanted the Constitution to sound a lot more like Calhoun, which is it was a pro-slavery Constitution. Because Sean Huelentz didn't make that argument in his book, and he didn't think that the history supported it, he got hammered in the New York Review of Books as a result. He got read out of the club, as it were. So I think, and he hasn't responded to me. I'm nobody, he's somebody. But I am surmising that the reason why he took the occasion of Senator Cotton's somewhat clumsy statement about slavery being a necessary evil as an occasion to make amends by saying, well, we all know that slavery wasn't necessary. That's ridiculous. And so I won't say any more about that. I would just say, Google my name and put Tom Cotton in it, and you'll go to my editorial on the American Mind, the Claremont Institute's American Mind website, and you'll see a more detailed analysis of what was said by both parties and why I think in the end, Senator Cotton was right in what he was saying. And to try to turn him into some kind of neo-Confederate, it is ridiculous. On the question of retaining Lee, I was rolled by my faculty on that one. 4 out of 5 W&L faculty, 200 some odd faculty, voted for a resolution calling for our trustees to remove the name of Lee from Washington and Lee University. Quickly here, Robert E. Lee, at the end of the Civil War, had nothing to do, no means of employment, had lost Arlington, right? The Union Army deliberately turned it into today's Arlington, a cemetery. Lee was not moving back there with his family. So he was invited to become the president of a podunk boys college called Washington College. And it was called Washington College because Washington had donated canal shares as part of one of its early endowments. And the profits made from that canal would support and actually enable the institution to survive. So Lee accepts the appointment of president for Washington College, and for the last 5 years of his life, 65 to 1870, he turns a college of about 40, 50 kids into 400 students, both North and South, publicly says we've got to be supportive of the federal government. We lost the war. Don't put up any monuments to the Confederacy. Let's rebuild the South. Let's rebuild Virginia. And so I'm a Lincoln fan, obviously. I teach a course every year called Lincoln Statesmanship. I believe Lee is a traitor. But for his presidency, at a time that basically kept the institution afloat and actually was very forward thinking in a number of his innovations. I don't have time to get into the detail. Google my name, put in Richmond Times-Dispatch, and you'll read my 750-word editorial on that. But what I say is that the name deserves to stay because of what he did at a pivotal moment and in a monumental way, not just for the college, but for the country. The example of how he was president of that college, I think, goes a long way, longer, in fact, than any contemporary, benefactor today who donates millions of dollars. I think what Lee did at his time was more important to the viability of the college and put us on a path to greatness, right? The last U.S. News and World Report that I checked, we're number 5, tied for number 5 in the, number 9 in the country as a top liberal arts college. I think that's a reputation that took years to build. Washington and Lee were critical to that. The institution did not exist to promote slavery or white supremacy. So those elements of either Washington or Lee, I think, are irrelevant in terms of the impact and the importance that they had on my institution. And so that's why I support it. I'm not a fan of Lee. Look over my shoulder, this shoulder, right? That's Frederick Douglass. That's Abraham Lincoln. Those are my heroes. And so, again, if you want any more detail about that, just Google my name, Richmond Times-Dispatch, and American Mind, and you'll see more than you want to know.
Thank you so much, Professor Morell, for joining us, and for everyone who joined us on the webinar on Zoom and on YouTube Live. And I just would like to remind folks that the video will be available on YouTube after it ends, and that to join us for our firing line debate next week on Thursday, the 24th, on the true extent of executive power.
Thank you again, Professor Morell. It was great to have you, and thank you, and we hope to have you back someday.
Great, wonderful, appreciate it. Thanks for putting this together, guys.
Yep, bye-bye.